Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Constant Reader Scott Daly, and while I did hear the death clock ticking for a bit there, I am back and at full health.
And I'm Matt Freeman, and I've just started to hear it tick, actually.
Oh no, cancel this week's show.
Yes, I'm sorry, everyone. I apparently made it seem like Scott was on death's door with my little intro. And
I listened to it when the day the episode came out, and I can't remember exactly what you said, but something to the effect of Scott is very, very unwell. I was just like, oh my God, he made it sound like I'm dying.
I thought what I said was that you were feeling poorly, but maybe I don't remember what I said. You
might have said poorly, but you did the double very, like the double very, and your tone of voice was very grim. And I was like, oh my God, they're going to think I'm dead. I'm dead. No, I was doing fine. It's just the type of chest cold I had, like, just ripped apart my lungs and my neck and my throat and everything that is needed for talking, turns out. And I was just in no position to sit in front of a microphone and talk for a couple hours. So took the week off. Honestly, I probably could have pushed it, but then I just would have ruined my voice for the next month, because I did that earlier in the year, and I was just like had vocal problems for like a month after that, and it was terrible. So just thought it made more sense to take the week off, and we did it, and I'm back, and my voice isn't 100%, but it's like 97%. So I think we're good, but I'm alive.
Sounds good to me, and we're glad you're back.
Thank you. I'm glad too. We appreciate all y'all and your well wishes. I could tell people were concerned after what Matt said by the number of emails we got. Just thinking about you, Scott. And I was like, I'm fine. I am fine.
Well, yes.
And we appreciate your patience. I don't like to miss episodes. I don't like that at all. Matt knows it was a very tough call for me to finally just go, okay, we're just going to cancel this week. We're just going to pretend like this week didn't exist. Fortunately, we had an episode to play for y'all. I hope y'all enjoyed the Carrie episode. It's one of my favorite conversations we've had on other levels of the tower. So we hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah. That was a fun one.
But this week on the show, we are finally going to finish our coverage of Stephen King's Insomnia. We're going to take one final look back at this book before we put this mind trap aside and continue with our quest. We're also going to be answering all of your burning questions about this book and about us and about Stephen King and everything else you wanted to know. So that's the show. It's going to be a little bit shorter than normal, but it's going to be a good one.
Yeah. So, as we discussed, Scott is alive, and then we have some further announcements. First announcement is the winners of the Do the King Thing short fiction writing contest have been chosen. After a few rounds of voting, we have finally narrowed it down to the following three winners. In third place, we have The Parking Lot by Dylan Trude. This is a really fun story about a sort of otherworldly presence that is haunting our main character. I found it very creepy and atmospheric. Yeah, it was delightful. So congratulations on that. In second place, we had the story Far Away and Faraday by Matt Newsom, where we have some. I'm leaning toward not spoiling these because I want people to read them if they haven't. But a story about coming back from the dead, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's just a guy is trapped in an elevator with a corpse, and then shit happens. And it's delightful. Yeah,
solid premise. And then finally, the winner of the contest was Tallulah's Cab Ride by Jody Handley. So congratulations to all three of those. The Tallulah's Cab Ride story is about somebody who draws pictures, and they're kind of creepy, and some of them might look familiar to readers of the Dark Tower series.
Yeah, and I mean, we get to see a scene from the Dark Tower from a different angle, and it's pretty fun. I enjoyed all of these stories. Every single story that was submitted, I really enjoyed. These three were a lot of fun. Congratulations to our winners, and congratulations to everyone else. Y'all all deserve a round of applause and a pat yourself on the back. I think what we're going to do, Matt, is we're going to set up a post on our website that has links to read every single one of these stories, including our 3 winners. So in case you're just listening out there and you're curious about these stories, you can go check them out and read them at your leisure. And then, of course, we are going to do a very special episode of Kingslingers where we read out loud the 3 winning stories, and then maybe we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail after that.
That's right. And that will be fun.
It's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be a lot of fun. And also to you 3 winners, you should be getting an email from us soon. Hopefully by the time you're listening to this, you've already got it. But if not, feel free to shoot an email to kingslingerspod@gmail.com saying, hey, where's my email? Because we owe you guys some prizes and we need to set that up with you. So hopefully you'll be hearing from us soon.
Yep.
Congratulations. That's so fun. We're definitely going to do it again, and it will definitely take less amount of time and be much better organized.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, we just didn't expect we'd get that many stories in. So, a good problem to have. And I hope that everybody who participated had fun. Yeah,
me too. All right. One more quick announcement. We do have a new Other Levels of the Tower episode out this week. This is, for those that don't know, it's our Patreon exclusive bonus podcast we do once a month, where we take a look at adaptations of Stephen King stories. This month, we looked at Stephen King's Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep. It was such a fun conversation. We recorded that yesterday, actually, and I really love the hell out of that movie, and I love the hell out of that conversation. So if you're a patron, make sure you check it out. If you're not a patron, never been a better time, because you got this episode and you got a bunch more. Did you like our conversation about Carrie? Well, we talked about Carrie 2013 a few months ago, and so that's there too.
Yeah. And if you didn't know, Dr. Sleep is a really, really good movie. I'm really glad that I got a chance to watch that.
I'm so glad too. I'm so glad. And I'm so glad we've got our next project after this, where we're going to do our Flanagan cast.
I'm laughing because I know that this is probably going to actually happen at some point.
See, that's how it all happens. It starts as a joke. And then at some point the joke goes away, and then we have Kingslingers.
Right. You just keep saying it and then I forget that it was ever a joke.
Yeah, there you go. One final quick announcement. In case you didn't know, we're starting a new book next week. So there's still time to go out and get Hearts in Atlantis, which is the book we're going to be covering over the next few weeks. We're only going to be covering the short story Low Men and Yellow Coats. We've gotten a few emails from people that say, please cover the other stories in that book. It just doesn't fit with our theme. I mean, there are very small, minor cameo-esque Dark Tower connections in the other stories in the book, but really we're focusing on Low Men and Yellow Coats for a very specific reason this time around. So that's all we're doing for now. But that is going to begin next week, and we'll be covering that for the next month. So very, very exciting.
Yeah, I love new book time.
All right, that's it for announcements, Matt. Let's talk about Insomnia. Are you ready?
I am.
So normally on these sections, we do kind of our back and forth conversation about what we thought overall about the book, and then we shift into our mailbag questions. But I felt like this time we got so many mailbag questions that were hitting things that I figured we would talk about anyway, that we're just going to take that whole thing and just mix it all together. So we're going to be reading questions as we're talking about the book. It's all just going to be one big overview section. No structure at all. We're just going to go crazy.
I hate structure.
Yeah. So speaking of structure, Matt, what did you think of Insomnia? What were your overall thoughts of Stephen King's Insomnia?
I mean, my takeaway is that I think this book might have affected me much more than almost any of the books that I've read in recent times, because, as I said, a few times on the show, I don't like to think about getting old, and I don't like to think about dying, and I don't like to think about my parents getting old and dying, and I don't like to, okay. I was debating whether I was going to say this on the show, but I had 2 of my grandparents pass away within the last year, basically. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of death and being very, very old and sick has been kind of omnipresent in a way that was not fun. And so in that way, the book was not terribly fun for me, but at the same time, I think it was healthier for me to have this story that was allowing me to grapple with these ideas in a fictional framework, and the ability to think these things through and talk these things through with you actually honestly probably helped me process a lot of the stuff that has been happening in my real life. And I know everybody's always kind of in the process of losing someone, if you want to be super macabre. So this book, in some sense, I think serves that purpose for almost anyone who reads it.
Yeah. I mean, we got a lot of emails from people over the course of this book that you said, you know, they just recently lost someone or had lost someone within the past year. I mean, like we're living in a time where a lot of people have died to this pandemic. And so people are just, especially older people. And so we're living in a time when I think more than ever, we happen to know people that have passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that definitely charges the meaning of a lot of the story. And I think one of the most fun things about getting to read the story at the pace that we're doing and the way that we're doing it is we really are kind of forced to confront their feelings about these things. Like, I think if you were reading this book just on its own for fun on the side, you wouldn't necessarily have to confront the feeling that the book instilled in, you know, like it made you uncomfortable, it made you upset, it triggered things and reminded you of things in your real life, and you could kind of just go, oh, I don't like that, I'm going to move beyond it. But because I'm putting you in front of a microphone each week and saying, Matt, what do you think about this? Suddenly you're forced to confront how that makes you feel. And
yeah,
I think that's great, because I think that's what stories should be doing. And a lot of times we're just diving into them so quickly and moving past them so quickly that we're kind of able to play that aversion avoidance game.
Yeah. And I think it brought me to a place of kind of accepting a lot of realities that I would prefer to just not think about and thus not accept. And that was on the net positive. And so, you know, you're asking me what my overall thoughts were. It's funny because everything I just said there doesn't have a ton to do with the book, but on the other hand, it does, because these are the things the book was demanding that we think about and pay attention to and struggle with, because even the characters themselves, you know, Ralph is the perfect, protagonist here, because he has an arc of not being able to accept this, not wanting to think about it, and being forced to, you know, confront it, think about it, and ultimately accept it. And that's, you know, exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. I guess, like, it feels weird to ask you to compare it to the Dark Tower novel. So I think the thing to do here is perhaps compare it to our other season 2 novel, of which there's only one right now. So how do you think Insomnia stacks up against Salem's Lot? In your mind, after having read both of these novels?
Well, I mean, it's funny to me because I feel like there are so many things about it that are different that I almost want to say it feels like it's an entirely different author. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that are similar. Like, it's King always loves his referentiality to other works of fiction, you know, but both subtle and explicit. That's one thing that was the case in both of these season 2 books. But, you know, just kind of the maturity of both the character and I think just like the approach to writing is so much further along in this book. Like, this is just clearly an older person who wrote this book, and
definitely
with a broader and deeper understanding of humanity. I don't know, that's my first cut at your question. What do you think? How do you compare the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's Salem's Lot is a classic in my mind, and you know, when we talked about that book, we talked about the things about it that I didn't quite like and still don't quite like, and that it all kind of revolves around not the characters as a whole, but our protagonist. We talked about this a lot, so I won't relitigate Ben Mears and his lack of character, but I think Salem's Lot is this weird book where, like, I think I enjoy the prose more. Like, I think Stephen King is a better writer at the point where he wrote Insomnia than he was when he wrote Salem's Lot, like, for sure. But I think some of the prose of Salem's Lot is King trying to do this thing that he did very early in his career, where he's trying to really channel this flowery, image heavy, beautiful language. And it's not that there's none of that in Insomnia. It's just like, it's much less out of style. Like, King is I think by Insomnia had confidently found his voice, and he kind of just sticks to his voice, where I feel like in Salem's Lot there were moments where we talked about this, where like the voice of the novel like shifts dramatically, and suddenly we're doing this like sweeping over the town and talking about, you know, messages through telephone wires, and this beautifully rich text and prose that I really, really appreciated. There's not as much of that in Insomnia, but I like the characters in Insomnia so much better, specifically the character, the protagonist. I think, you know, I think I said this at the beginning of covering this book, that Ralph Roberts is one of my favorite Stephen King protagonists. And at no part in covering this book did my mind change about that. In fact, I think I'm even more confident in saying that nowadays, that I love Ralph. I think he's complex and rich and interesting. I love the ways in which King intentionally hides stuff about him from us, like this really weird thing that I so many other King protagonists don't do this, where they're going to tell you their life story and they're going to go into excruciating detail in every important aspect of their life, where Ralph Roberts will just be 700 pages into a book and go, oh yeah, by the way, I had a brother, forgot to mention him. It's something that's so unique to this guy. He has such a warm heart. He's such a fascinating, interesting person, and as you said, aligns to the themes and the ideas of the book just absolutely perfectly. He's the perfect protagonist for this book. He's a very likable person. Everything fits together very nicely in this book. And that's, I did not have that to say about Salem's Lot. So
yeah, it's, I think there's a lot about Salem's Lot to like, and yet also there's a lot about it that makes it evident that it's a very early book for this writer, who then went on to write 1 million books and get much, much more experienced.
Yeah, I mean, like even just like the goal of the novel, right? Like Salem's Lot is King very specifically trying to do Dracula, but small town.
Yeah.
And so like the reason the language is maybe a bit more flowery, a bit more purple, is because he's trying to channel this gothic Dracula-esque tone.
Yeah.
And Insomnia really isn't I really sat down and tried to think about this, like what other novel out there is Insomnia like? And I can't think of anything. I mean, I'm sure there's some out there, but it is really a just pure Stephen King concept, idea, execution from beginning to end. He's not doing anything with it. He's not channeling another type of story, another type of author. It's just, this is just Stephen King.
Yeah, I agree. You know, it's funny. My response to that goes very well with the first mailbag question that we got. So should I go ahead and read that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the first question from Pedro Achilles was, in On Writing, King talks about situation-driven stories, such as what if vampires invaded a small New England town, and plot-driven stories, and his preference for the former. He talks about his dislike of plot and refers specifically to Insomnia as one of his few plotted novels. He calls the results less than inspiring, stiff, and trying too hard. Do you agree or disagree with King's assessment? How would you compare the writing of a situation-driven book like Salem's Lot to something more plotty like Insomnia?
So what do you think, Matt?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because if you hadn't told me that Insomnia was supposed to be plotty, I don't think I would have known, you know, I mean, because it seems very much like just a bunch of weird, crazy ass shit's happening all the time.
It does. I do think if you look at the book, there are points where you can see perhaps he knew what the ending was going to be and is working his way backwards from it. You know, like I know Ralph's going to end up in the plane with Ed Deep now, trying to stop him from crashing it. How do I get there? And there's a lot of plot in this book. I think there's a lot of plot in this book.
Yeah. Well, so to directly answer the question, I think there's pros and cons. There's strengths and weaknesses of the two. So I just happened to be on a YouTube binge of listening to a bunch of like writing coaches and screenwriting coaches on YouTube giving like interviews. And I heard this dichotomy, which is not a novel thing. It's just this one professor who was saying like there's basically, well, okay, so the reason it's worth bringing up here is it's a slightly different dichotomy than I'd usually heard, because usually you hear, you hear, okay, there's Seat of the Pantsers who just write and they make up the story as they go, and then there's gardeners, and then there's architects, there's plotters who meticulously plot out the story ahead of time. And that wasn't quite the distinction he made. The distinction he made was there are people who think in terms of plot and story structure, and then there are people who think in terms of character and authenticity of character decisions. And what he said is the thing about when you get new writers in and you have somebody who's really good at character, their stories will tend to meander and leave you feeling frustrated because you're not really sure what exactly happened. And while the character did jump off the page and you liked the character and you cared about the character, if anything, you were frustrated because nothing happened to the character. And then on the flip side, the plotty, more structural writers would have, these very sort of intricate premise driven stories, but then you wouldn't really care because you wouldn't care about the character. And so that wouldn't be very memorable ultimately. Now, the thing about Stephen King is, I would say that if you were to take young Stephen King, he was definitely a guy who understood character, and he's always understood character. Character, I would say, has always been his natural strength, right? Now, the thing that writing coach said is that he makes all of his character-centric writers learn how to do plot, and all of his plot-centric writers entirely focus on character for a whole year and not do any plots. And so, Stephen King obviously can do a plotty story. It's just that, and I think it actually, the end result is actually better in a sense, because it's not like this story suffered. It's not like Ralph Roberts suffered as a character. It's not like at any point we were like, "No, this felt inauthentic," or I feel like this is a cold and sterile story. I don't think either of us said anything like that at any point, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think it's ironic because I think having the clear plotting in this book actually allows King to track Ralph Roberts as a character better, as specifically compared to Ben Mears and Salem's Lot, right? Right. Because he kind of spent a lot of time and plotted out the story. The story has a lot of plot. We can kind of graft the character changes onto the plot in a way that, perhaps when he's writing Seat of His Pants a little bit, he doesn't do as much. And that's more of a job for the edit to come back and take the places that the story went and tie the themes back to the character. Whenever I think about this, I always think about Carrie. I always think about the fact that when Stephen King originally wrote the shower scene in Carrie with her getting the period, and then eventually wrote the pig's blood, he hadn't actually consciously tied those two images together thematically. They just became the thing that made sense, and perhaps subconsciously he was tying the image of blood together, but he had to actually go back through on an edit and reinforce the blood image and tie it together throughout the entire story, this concept of blood and what it means thematically for the story. And it's not that didn't happen in Salem's Lot, but in a book like Insomnia, where I think there's so much more plot things, I think it's just perhaps easier to graft your character motivations and changes and shifts onto that much plot. I will say, I think the plotting is some of the weakest part of this book. When we have to shift into plot overdrive, which is a lot of the middle part of this book, I think is when the book gets its weakest. When we're just sitting with the characters and kind of exploring Ralph Roberts as he's figuring out what this insomnia means, and as he's bonding with Lois, and those are the best parts of the book.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that for me, a lot of the exposition, I almost want to just do the experiment of just literally cut it out. Just like Clotho and Lachesis, cut them out. and it's, I say that, with all due, caution, because I like those characters. I think that's an interesting and kind of creative thing to do. I'm just not sure that taking those big chunks of pages out of the middle of the book to dump all this info adds a whole lot. Then again, maybe I'm wrong, because I know they add a lot of information that then is important to the further decision making that Ralph makes, right? So
yeah. Well, and they help to define, I don't know if we ever actually explicitly stated this, but just Clotho and Lachesis as a personification of this idea that like life is so far out of your control and your frustration with that. Like, I mean, we kind of talked about this with Atropos and just like the personification of the random cruelty of life. But Clotho and Lachesis are really like the non-random cruelty of life, that like this idea that everything has a plan, everything has a purpose, and yet it just feels like that fact like makes it feel like you're being led by the nose, like you're being controlled, and just the innate frustration with that and the lack of understanding. Like, you're telling me my wife dying was part of the plan. You're telling me me, you know, suffering and not being able to sleep for months and months and months is part of the plan. Like, who the fuck is making this plan? If this and so Clotho and Lachesis, by being characters that are personified, Ralph gets to work out his frustration on these concepts of life on a physical being. And therefore his, you know, growth towards pity and some semblance of respect of Clotho and Lachesis is symbolically his acceptance of the parts of life that we can't control. And it's very clever. And it's not like it's cheating, but it's just like what stories can do really well by just, okay, let's take this abstract concept and then make it a character. And then you can have our character battle against it literally, and you can show its change by how he interacts with it. Like, it's just how effective stories are. And so I agree that like you probably could excise them from the book and it would still, like, I think we would still love Ralph Roberts as a human. But yeah, they're just such a fun narrative device to really sell Ralph's arc and his transformation.
Yeah, I agree that, you know, then maybe you lose this conflict between the fact that it kind of sucks to feel like your life is determined, but then it also kind of sucks to feel like your life is totally random and out of your control for that reason. Yeah. And if you're going to pick one of those, maybe you should pick the purpose, right? But yeah, I think it's just that, I don't know, King, he does these very bizarre things sometimes. Like a lot of what happens in the Dark Tower, very like bizarre. And as we've joked many times, like if you just read out what happens, you're like, oh yeah, that's crazy. But at the time it felt very normal and logical, because within the frame of the story, it was very logical actually. Yeah. And that's, you know, that's what he was doing here. I think the one place where it being plotty might have been sort of visible is the part that we kind of complained about. I don't know, whenever that was, where we hide information about what Ralph is learning from Clotho and Lachesis, and we're seeing it from Lois's eyes. In retrospect, and maybe even at the time, that kind of feels like whenever I get like stuck in a writing problem and I'm like, well, shit, I need to have this character make this decision here, but I can't reveal this information yet because I have to, because then that spoils this surprise. Yeah. And then you end up doing some kind of bending over backwards thing, and it never quite feels organic, because it isn't organic. It's the definition of contrived, which is what this is here. So, and
the plotty parts that bother me the most are the ones that our character's agency is almost completely removed. And I understand that's like one of the themes of the novel. So like you want to do that a little bit, but like the things I'm thinking about specifically are, we do our High Ridge section of the book, and then the novel is almost like, okay, so what do we do next? And then King's solution for that is just have Old Door appear and tell our characters where to go. And it's like, that's not motivated by character at all. And once we get Ralph and Lois to the convention center, then we allow their character motivation to take over again. And it's like, so we just like yada yada through some plot to get to the next part where our characters actually start dictating the story again. But you know, it just feels a little bit like, you know, our chess pieces are having to be pushed to the correct location for them to do the next part of their strategy. And that's not my favorite thing. But I mean, like, all this aside, like, I really liked this book a whole bunch. Like, this is like, we're complaining about little tiny things because I think we both overall enjoyed our experience with the story a lot. Yeah.
And I think, you know, the specific question that Pedro Achilles asked here is like, how do you know, compare and contrast the King stories that are more premise driven and propelled by the characters versus ones that are plotted out? And I mean, I think that you can also, you know, nitpick the stories that are just premise driven, because they, as that writing coach that I just referred to said, if it just kind of feels like a sort of meandering course following this character and then it just kind of ends, then that can be unsatisfying in its own way. Like you want some kind of feeling of an arc.
Yeah.
And
I mean, half of Salem's Lot is just characters struggling with whether or not they believe that there are vampires in the town for like 300 pages. And like, look, I liked a lot of that stuff. I'm not saying I didn't, but that is true. That's half the book of just various characters saying vampires are real. No, they're not. I'll prove it to you. I don't believe it. And I think that's a result of his less plot driven storytelling.
Yeah, I think so.
Really great question, though. Really great question. Thanks, Pedro Achilles.
Fun conversation. Yeah,
I think overall King is a little too hard on himself. I mean, you're your own worst critic, right? And so I think he enjoys a lot of Insomnia, but I think it's probably less fun to write those types of stories, maybe, because like you're not discovering the story as you go a little bit.
I've definitely found it almost impossible to write stories that I plotted out in advance. Like the way I conceive of it is like, well, I already did the fun part, which was figuring out like what the story was going to be. And now I'm basically done. And it's just a matter of penciling in the details, which is way less fun than like discovering the story. Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. All right. So our next big idea we're going to talk about is Roland Deschain, Insomnia, and the Mind Trap. We have Eric T, who asks us directly, Roland refused a chance to read this book. Why? Was he correct that this would have been a trap for him? If so, what was it? So I want to get your theory here, Matt. At the end of Insomnia, is Insomnia a mind trap? If so, why?
I only have one idea for this. Maybe I said this before. I don't remember because it's been 2 weeks. You have
not on the podcast. Okay. You said it to me in private, but not on the show.
Yeah. So and Roland wouldn't have known this, but sometimes he has intuitions, right? So that's the thing about Roland is he has intuitions that he should or should not do certain things. But one thing that I thought about is the idea that if he had known in advance how important Patrick Danville was, then that would have robbed him of the opportunity to show a tiny measure of selflessness. Like for example, he never would have told Patrick Danville to go expose himself to the Crimson King's line of fire and grab the rose, and then changed his mind and done it himself. If he had known that Patrick Danville was the super, super important cosmic savior, he would have just protected him as part of his mission, right? He would have protected him as part of the mission of the tower.
Sure.
But as it is, Patrick Danville is just some kid he ran across who is of no particular significance, but useful to him. And so he puts him to use. And then in the end, he does a very slightly compassionate thing, which I think in the course of, Roland and his arc actually matters a lot. Like it matters that he was the one to do this thing. I'm speaking specifically about the fact that he grabs the rose and it shreds his hand. And then he realizes that if Patrick had been the one to do that, then Patrick would have shredded his hand and then he wouldn't have been able to use his drawing ability.
Yeah, but you're totally right that if he knows Patrick's significance for certain, then that is not motivated by empathy and gregariousness. That's motivated by necessity, which is which is how Roland is always motivated. And so you want to show a different version to that character.
Yeah. So the problem with this theory is that there was no way Roland could have known that. So I don't know what his own internal rationale was exactly, but that is one way in which I can see it being a kind of trap for him.
Yeah, I mean, the honest question is we'll never know. The honest answer is we'll never know the answer. So right. All of this is just us having fun. So I think that's the fine theory. My theory is a little more mean to Roland. And again, it doesn't explain why he would know this, but if you look at what Insomnia is as a book, it's a book about how a person can challenge the purpose that is laid out for them and succeed, right? Mm-hmm. That literally Ka is rewritten in this story because Ralph Roberts says, no, I don't want to do that. And I refuse to submit to your idea that I have to do that. And so for a character like Roland, who has kind of hinged his entire existence on the fact that he's a slave to Ka, like he talks about it begrudgingly, but he also happily continues to do it. it's kind of his excuse and his motivating factor at the same time. A book in which someone, you know, rewrites their stars, changes their stripes, changes what Ka is inherently damaging to their worldview. Now, to go back to your same point, how the hell would Roland Deschain know that by just looking at the book offhand? He wouldn't. But it seems to me that that's like a fun, deeper read on perhaps why a person like Roland would reject the story that contains that these pages contain.
Yeah, right. Well, I think the most fun thing to think about for me is that it's not like the Tet Corporation says to him, "Hey, Roland, here's some major plot points from the novel Insomnia that you should know." Mm-hmm. They say, "Here's the book. You should read it," and then he decides not to.
Yeah.
So, and obviously King has a bunch of other Dark Tower connections, and he didn't have them say, here's a book of everything that they're going to read on Kingslingers season 2. Read all of these. He just gives him Insomnia. They just give him Insomnia.
Yeah.
So why only Insomnia? I mean, I know the obvious answer is that it has Patrick Danville and it has the Crimson King.
Yeah.
And it has Roland in a picture, but
this is what I mean. Both Pear Jane asks us. She says, "I never really got why Insomnia was such a big deal to the Calvins. One assumes it was Patrick Danville, but then the other info was wrong. And then Roland doesn't read it anyway. So why did the Calvins even recommend a bum hug?" And then Steve D asks, "If Roland and Susanna had read it, what do you think would have come of it? I don't know if it would have changed anything. That being said, why mention it at all? Just have Roland throw it away." And my very boring and dualistic answer to this is King realized that he was going to change the ending and make Insomnia inaccurate. And so he mentioned it in his book as existing and then said, "Nah, this isn't real," and had his character throw it away as if to signal to the reader that the thing that you think is going to be the end of the story is not quite, because I've changed my mind on a lot of things. I've changed my mind on kind of what the Crimson King is going to look like. I've changed my mind on exactly what Patrick Danville's role in this thing is going to be. I changed my mind on what Patrick Danville's fate is going to be. If you're looking at, if you, the reader, are going into book 7, are going into the ending of the story, you know, with your Insomnia on your desk highlighted and note cards, and the Calvins are, I think, stand-ins for us, you know, constant readers, King obsessives that sit down and analyze all this stuff and try to figure out what's going on. So if you're going into the final steps of the Dark Tower, you know, expecting all this stuff to play out in very specific ways because it's been set up before, King is kind of just gesturing to it and saying, "Hey, by the way, no, that's not how it's going to go." I mean, that's a very boring Watsonian answer, because it's not one, like, but that's, I think, if I had to guess why King made the decision to introduce the book and then immediately toss it out the window, that's why, I think.
Yeah, and Roland's just not the kind of guy who I can imagine like sitting down and reading a whole bunch of books and then using that to like craft some kind of intricate like Munchkin loophole based way of winning. Like he's just gonna walk and shoot his way through.
He's not. He doesn't think that way. Yeah. So, and the only way it would have been was if, like, I think he even imagines Susanna, reading it to him around firelight or at the end of the night, like there. And I think the other thing is, the other reason he rejects it is because that image is comforting to him of Susanna reading this book to him by firelight at the end of the night, like they're a quartet still, like they're a family still. And at this point, the quartet has been dissolved. They are not connected in that way anymore. And I think that the idea to Roland of holding on to that feeling and that way of life that is gone is something he just can't bring himself to do. And so maybe it's less about Insomnia itself and more about Roland's state of mind, and what he imagines reading this book would be like, and he just can't do that anymore. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. That feels right.
Yeah, but unfortunately, there's not like an easy, neat answer to this thing, right? Mm-hmm. I think everything we've all talked about is interesting, and various levels of that feels right to me, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you can go even more Doyleistically and have this and just say King wanted to let his Dark Tower readers know that there is something very Dark Tower relevant that happens in Insomnia.
Yeah, so go read that book.
So go read that book, but he's not going to tell you what happened, and that's like that's the ultimate Doyleist answer.
Yeah, and also I don't know, like in none of the Dark Tower connections throughout the story has there ever been like a, well, let me tell you what happens in this whole book. Like even the closest one to that is Salem's Lot, right? We basically get to reread what happens with Father Callahan at the end of his confrontation with Barlow. But even that is not like a, let's have you read this whole story and see what you gain from it. It's just like, I don't think he wants to directly interface with his other works in that kind of way. He likes to gesture towards it because it's fun. It's fun to think of this existing in a world in which Salem's Lot is literally a book. Insomnia is literally a book. But it doesn't directly interface in that kind of way where the characters are going to sit there and turn the pages. And he always was resistant to this idea of the characters reading their own existence or reading the events of the story as they were unfolding. Yeah,
that seems like that would become an idea that just hijacks the whole story. Like that's a book premise unto itself, is the idea that you find a novel and then you realize that this is the story of your life, and then you're like, okay, what do you do from here? That it ceases to be whatever story it was before, and it becomes about that.
I agree.
All right, so shall we move on to the next discussion topic?
Yeah. So Shenanigoats asks, why do you think Insomnia never received an adaptation?
And Emperor Fry the Solid sort of continues along this line and says, if you did make an Insomnia movie and some bullshit producers wanted you to end the movie and they forgot everything and were pretty much happy for most of the rest of their lives, just kidding. How would you make the epilogue really ring like it does in the book? Man's choices, a life for a life, the building knowledge of his fate, etc., in a scene with so many competing visual elements. So, in short, 2 questions about adaptation.
Yeah. But let's answer the first one first.
Sure.
Why, in your opinion, Matt, is this one of the few Stephen King stories without an adaptation?
I mean, it's kind of a depressing book, and it's not really horror in the sense that people usually think of horror or of Stephen King for that matter. It's this just kind of weird supernatural genre that's not a particularly good fit with anything you're used to. I think one of the main things about it is like it's got an elderly protagonist, which, I mean, I don't have all the box office numbers at my fingertips, but I feel like films with elderly protagonists just don't tend to do well. Like how many can you even think of? And then most of those are, not super well known. I'm literally having trouble thinking of any.
Yeah, but I mean, they're mostly like about how that elderly protagonist is like decaying and dying, and it's not that isn't part of Insomnia, but Ralph Roberts is not a character, like is a character who's vibrant and alive and actually becomes more alive over the course of the story.
And then there's also the fact that this book rather, just drives headfirst into every conceivable political hot button issue.
Yeah.
And that Hollywood or anybody putting money into a film might just be like, you know what? No, thanks. Not interested in sticking my finger in that light socket.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think what it comes down to is this is like the holy trinity of we can't do this. Elderly protagonist, hot button political issues that are sure to piss off at least every possible side, and then really, really weird out there shit that is very hard to sell. Like, I mean, just kind of think of what a trailer, like what would the marketing for an Insomnia movie be? You know, like right. You probably couldn't get into the bald doctor shit in the trailer, but you would have to get into the aura shit. Like you would have to get into, so you could either sell it as old man losing his mind because of insomnia, or you could sell it as old man experiencing metaphysical LSD type visions because of insomnia, and like it's just a hard sell, man. It's just a hard sell. There's things that can work very well in a novelistic form, and there's concepts that are immediately adaptable. Like Salem's Lot is a perfect example. Like just this, the concept of Salem's Lot is just immediately like, oh yeah, we can absolutely make a movie out of this. This concept is weird. It's different. It's not that it's unfilmable. It's just that if you're a Hollywood producer and you're looking for a few $1 million to drop on a property, this is very low on the list, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Think about Dreamcatcher. Like Dreamcatcher. Okay, I haven't read it still, obviously, but it's a movie where people's reactions to it were widely negative. Yeah, and I think that's in large part because it's got all of this weird stuff. I don't know what other word to use it other than just the weird stuff, where it's like doesn't really fit too well into any boxes. You know, Dreamcatcher in particular has like a mixture of alien invasion and psychics, which is a very fun concept, actually. But it just gives you so much legwork that you have to do to establish these plot elements that the movie, in movie format, it becomes totally overwhelming. In fact, I think one of the screenwriting books that I read at one point literally said the advice, you can either have, aliens, or you can have magic, or you can have androids, or you can have psychic powers, but don't do more than one of those at a time. And I think the basic reasoning is simply that, like, for every one of these elements you include, you have to set it up. And the time it takes to set up multiple of these things, it just bogs down the movie completely. Now, it doesn't really bog down a novel, because a novel is really allowed to sprawl in ways that a movie is not.
But for everything you just said, Dreamcatcher, I totally understand why they made that movie, because the concept of 4 old childhood friends spending a week alone together in a cabin in the middle of the woods, and then weird alien shit starts happening, is such an easier sell than everything that's going on in Insomnia. Like it's just easier to sell that, and you can kind of sell it in a way that gestures around the psychic alien fusion that is that story, that just goes off the wall and crazy. God, what a weird movie. But I think Insomnia is not a story that allows you to have that. Like there's just really no hook here. Like the hook is old man gets insomnia, and it's okay. Okay. That sucks for him.
Yeah. It's unexplained.
Yeah.
He keeps waking up earlier and earlier. I mean, what's funny is the way King introduces it in the book, we care about Ralph, and then the insomnia is introduced, and then we're like, oh, that's interesting. What's going on? But you're exactly right that, like, in trailer format, that doesn't work very well. I mean, you can even see how you'd film it. Like you got the actor, he wakes up, he looks at the clock. You do a bunch of cuts of progressive days of him looking at the clock, and it's getting earlier and earlier each day, and him lying in bed, like you could do it. It's just like you said, it's not intrinsically compelling. It's not a premise that hooks you. Like we've talked a million times about how King is great at these fantastic premises. I don't know how to even describe the premise of Insomnia in a way that would persuade someone to read it. Like I was telling my mom about this book, and I'm like, I basically pitched it as like, it really made me think about like death and growing old in a way that I never had before.
Yeah.
Which has nothing to do with the plot, right? It's
right. Like, I mean, The Shining, family trapped in a ghost hotel. Boom.
Right.
Stand. Terrible plague wipes out most of humanity. The remainders have to come together or die. Spooky clown haunts children. These are all like very easy to digest and understand hooks. Insomnia is literally old man can't sleep, starts seeing auras, starts seeing things that lead to conflict that will threaten the fate of humanity. I also think like you can't really carve the Dark Tower stuff out of this story. Because I mean, like, we're about to talk about Low Men in Yellow Coats, and that is a story that does have an adaptation. Hearts in Atlantis, they made into a movie. It stars Anthony Hopkins. But they basically carved all the Dark Tower stuff out of that story. They're just like, the low men in that story are not the Dark Tower low men. They just easily said, okay, we're just going to make them government people. Dark Tower stuff gone. I don't think you can do that, because it's, the whole point is that this kid is some mystical, powerful thing that's going to save the entirety of existence. And maybe you could do that without the Dark Tower stuff, but it's just, I think it's too intrinsically wrapped into Crimson King Dark Tower shenanigans, that it doesn't work well as a standalone thing, which you would basically need it to do if you're going to drop a few $1 million to make a movie out of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how you could even begin to approach the idea of like, why is this happening? Well, it's because basically Sauron wants it to happen.
Yeah.
It's like, what? You're just going to drop that in here? Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, Emperor Fry the Solid's question basically about how you would do the ending specifically, how to make the epilogue really ring, as they say. I mean, I think film is actually a great medium for making moments like that land.
Yeah.
Like I think I mentioned, like this is one of the few books that actually made me, actually tear up instead of just feel like, that was sad. And that sort of tells you that it's such a poignant story choice that you could definitely make me just, weep if it were on film. And if you did it right, of course. I think you just focus on the characters. You just focus on the people's reactions to what's happening. You don't need to show all of the complicated things that are happening involving the car and the red hat and the teleporting magic power that he has. Like, I think you try to streamline it and simplify it, and you focus more on showing human reactions and human emotion than just like the mechanics of what happened.
I agree. I love the scene and I love the writing of the scene, but I do think this is one particular moment that a visual medium can do really, really well on. I'm not a filmmaker, so I can't like sit down and say, oh, here's how I'd do it, and here's how I'd block it and shoot it, and here's the angles I would go for. But I just do think there is a real, you can really do this real sense of building of tension and emotion and the moments between the characters. Like I just have this very clear image in my head of what it would look like to show Natalie pushed out of the way at the last moment, and the both tragedy and also elation of that singular moment. And just like, I think the look on Ralph's face, like I think you would need you got to get a really good actor for Ralph, basically.
Yeah, and Lois. Yeah,
and you need to convey so much of the interiority of that moment on Ralph's face. And I think you would need, I would put it in a lot of close-ups of Ralph as he's making his final decision, as he's coming to terms with the decision, and as he's suffering the consequences of that decision.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to be focused as well on Lois's, anger and denial, that he's going to do this and trying to stop him. And then after it's happened, just her, being totally crushed. And then maybe at the last moment when she gets the gift of the vision of his soul, there's maybe a bit of bittersweet relief to that sorrow. And because it's going to be probably hers is going to be the last face that we see. You can even kind of imagine the zooming out from her face as we pull away, kind of ending to that scene.
And I mean the vision of the light coming through the boards of the wooden barn that he's in is one of the most like clear visual moments of the entire novel. And it's one of those moments that I think if you're a filmmaker, you're reading this book, that's one of those things that makes you say, I want to adapt this because I want to shoot that scene, and I want to capture why this is such a powerful visual element on film, and I want to show that. And I really think that any scene that has Ralph's death in it and Lois, taking his soul, being gifted his soul, you better include a very long, wonderful shot of the power of that life, the light shooting through those cracks in that wood.
Right. I now I can imagine like the, final sequence is Lois's face as she, transforms from sorrow to acceptance. And then you crossfade that with, just you're inside the barn, and then that fades to black or something like that.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. Cool.
And then maybe Ralph's eyes close.
Maybe
gets sleepiness.
All right. How do we get the rights to Insomnia?
I don't know, man. I this is interesting because I hope someone reads this book, gets an angle on it, and tries to make something out of it. I really do. Eventually, I think that would be really interesting to see what an adaptation of the story looks like, because it is certainly a challenge, and it's not the only story of King's that hasn't been adapted. The 90s are a really interesting time for Stephen King, actually. Like, this is in the midst of this kind of back-to-back sets of stories about women. We talked about this during the one of the episodes itself, but like we have Gerald's Game, we have Dolores Claiborne, we have Insomnia, and we have Rose Madder, which are all these like boom, 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 boom early 90s films about women and the suffering that women have gone through at the hands of abusive men. Like, it's something that's definitely on King's mind. And a lot of those stories have not been adapted. Rose Madder has never been adapted. Insomnia has never been adapted. Dolores Claiborne was adapted. And Gerald's Game just got adapted not too long ago. Was thought to be unadaptable. And it's a really interesting experimentation time for King, where I think he's like, the 80s kind of firmly established him as the king of horror. And in the 90s, he goes, okay, I want to explore some different things. And I want to maybe look at some of the criticism that people have laid against me in the eye a little bit and see if I can do better. Like, that's the idea of writing these women characters that he's been, like, critiqued about the way he writes them in the past, and trying to tell these stories. I don't know. It's really, the 90s are such a fascinating King time. And I think the result of a lot of the experimentation in this regard is not as many adaptations, not as many clear, obvious movie hits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, when you sit down to write a story, maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously, you're thinking like, am I writing for the market or am I writing for me? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the story idea just comes upon you, and it is what it is. And it maybe is a terrible fit for the market, and maybe is a great fit for the market. But I feel like that was a part of his career where maybe he was like, I want to explore these ideas. I'm Stephen King. I can do what I want. Mm-hmm. I don't have to write for the market. I don't have to think about whether things are going to be popular or which you can't really blame him. Once somebody's got a successful and established writing career, they know people are going to read their books, then I actually like the idea that they would be more experimental and bold and not just write things that they're sure people will like. Yeah.
Man, Dolores Claiborne, speaking of that, you've got me down a rabbit hole now. It's such a fascinating book, Matt, because he tells this entire story is told from the perspective of the title character, Dolores Claiborne. She's at a police station giving her confession for how she murdered her husband. And it's like, it's as if we're reading a transcript of her audio confession. Mm-hmm. But it's just her part. So like, there are, the detectives and other people in the book talking, but we never see, I was about to say hear them. We never see them. There's never any text from them, but we still hear Dolores Claiborne's reaction to them. It's like they say something and she'll react to it in the book. So it's literally just as if we're only getting access to the one track that is Dolores Claiborne's audio track, as if they were recording a podcast together, but we lost the cops track. It's such a fascinating experiment. It's a fun book to read. It's not my favorite King book, but I really enjoyed it. And it's like, this is 90s King is such, it's fun, man. It's fun. It's never going to be at the top of people's lists, I don't think, although Needful Things was about that time. But I don't know. He's just trying different things. And of course the movie adaptation is Kathy Bates doing another King role, and she's phenomenal in it.
Excellent. Yeah.
But
I'd like to watch that at some point, or maybe read it first.
Yeah, it's all kinds of fun. I went through the 90s in my chronological reread, I think last year, and fun times. Desperation, that's a late 90s King novel. One of my favorite books, actually. One of my favorite King books.
Okay, well,
I'm totally off the track now. You've got me a King rabbit hole.
Let's move on into the next subtopic, which is old age. And we got a bunch of questions about old age from MTN Dave 1979. Ralph is a 70-year-old man with insomnia. Maybe he was the incredible Eli Wallach's. Sorry, maybe it was the incredible Eli Wallach's performance in the audiobook, but Ralph seems way older. My dad is the same age as Stephen King and is much more active and mentally with it than Ralph and the old Sir Crew are portrayed. As a little kid, my grandparents seemed old when they were in their 60s. Now, as a 40-something and seeing my parents age 60 is nothing, and 70 hasn't slowed them down too much either. Maybe it's because modern medicine is better and people are living longer and healthier lives. Stephen King was 47 when this book was published, and now he's 74, older than Ralph. How do you think this view on being/getting old has changed? How would he write this character now?
This is a really good question. And I mean, I think I want to like talk about old age and talk about it around this question a lot. I think one of the interesting things about Stephen King is that he doesn't have, at least at this time in his life, didn't have a lot of examples of what old age looks like. His father left his family when he was very young. So he doesn't like get to watch his father grow older. I think his mom died in her early 60s. So he doesn't really get to see, his mom getting really elderly and becoming 70s and 80s and kind of thing. So, I mean, he does have his in-laws. I think Tabitha's parents both lived a very long time. I think they lived into their 90s, but they were probably about Ralph's age at the time writing this book. So maybe most of his experience of what the elderly are like comes from his in-laws, which is a step removed always,
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's really fascinating. I mean, obviously, this comes from this perspective of two people in their mid-30s who don't know what old age is like yet. I can imagine it, but I'm still not sure. But like, I don't know. This Ralph fits. Do you agree with Dave here that he feels like an older man than 70 years old?
Well, I think that maybe this is a generational thing, and I don't know. I could be completely full of it here, but I feel like the generation of which Ralph is a part, they had a mentality, and you can kind of confabulate something about the Great Depression or something, but like they had a mentality where they actually wanted to just be able to retire and kind of just take it easy and slow down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Whereas my dad is almost 70 and he has no plans to retire from his job. Like he's just like literally like, I don't want to stop. Like he doesn't want to retire. I think he's actually terrified of the idea of stopping his job because I think he's afraid that he'll just like shrivel up and die basically. Whereas his father's generation, they wanted to retire early. They basically wanted to slow down and be more like the way Ralph is portrayed here. So it's funny because I kind of want to have it both ways. I want to say like, yeah, my dad's close to Ralph's age, but he doesn't behave anything like Ralph. But I think that maybe people who were growing old in the early 90s, maybe they did kind of behave more like Ralph does. That's my recollection of the way my grandparents behaved. All of my grandparents behaved when I was a kid. Was like they were all retired. They all just wanted to. They all seemed to want to just have very like regular, calm lives.
Yeah,
you can hardly blame them. Like I'm not criticizing. It's just like Ralph reminds me of them much more than he does my own dad. So
yeah, I mean, by the time I was old enough to like be aware of my own existence, all my grandparents were retired.
Mm-hmm.
So I never lived in a world in which like I remember my grandparents working, but your kids are old enough to like be aware of their existence, old enough to be conscious, and their grandparents still working.
Yeah, absolutely.
My parents are not still working, but not like this is a very recent thing. And it really, my dad was not planning on retiring when he did. It was literally just because of COVID, the airline was like, does anyone want to retire early? Because we need to have less pilots because we don't need planes right now. And my dad was like, yeah, sure. Okay. So that it wasn't part of his plan. So he would still be working if not for the pandemic. So yeah, I mean, it definitely is different. I think also to Dave's point, like there's always going to be this thing where an age feels older the further away from it you are. Like I've never really thought about this, but like my grandparents were probably in their 50s when I was a little kid, which seems crazy.
Yeah, interesting. I'd have to do the math there, but
I mean, on my mom's side, my mom was the youngest of 5 kids, so they were always a little bit older. So they were in their 60s. But on my dad's side, my grandparents had their kids very young, and then my dad had us relatively young compared to how old people are when they have kids these days. And so, yeah, I mean, my grandpa he's 85 now. So that means when I was born, yeah, my God, maybe he was in his 40s when I was born.
That's interesting.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, it's funny because I had my kids, I had my first kid when I was like 27, which is like way younger than most of my peers have kids.
Yeah.
And with that's funny because like that's pretty old compared to when people used to start having kids.
Oh yeah, I mean, I had my first kid this year. I was 35.
Right.
My parents were 22 when they had my sister. So like by the time my parents were the age I am now, they had a teenager. Mm-hmm. It's just fucking crazy.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. Like things are different now. Ralph, I guess my honest answer is I never felt Ralph didn't feel like his age. He always felt like his age to me, or at least my understanding of what 70 is. I do think a 74-year-old Stephen King probably looks back at Ralph Roberts and says, I didn't quite get what 70 is like, because I hadn't experienced it yet. But that's not something I can answer with any kind of authority because I don't know what 70 is like either.
I think there's also an element of the book where it's like old is as old does, because Ralph sort of effectively becomes younger after this whole adventure when he shacks up with Lois and they have like a whole nother life together. And they both of them seem way more vibrant and part of the world. And like they're playing with little Natalie all the time. And like effectively, it's funny because they've lost the magical youthfulness, but they've gained a sort of, very real youthfulness in the way that they live their lives. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact is Ralph was just living like a much older man because he had kind of given up.
Yeah, I think it is fascinating how your mindset and that it dictates that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I think the thing that people have always told me, and that is become increasingly true the older I get, is that you never really feel your age. Mm-hmm. Like you feel like you, and then people tell you, oh, well, you is almost 40. And I'm like, well, what the fuck does that mean?
Right.
And I think the difference in that is that you can sometimes also feel older than you are. If you get stuck in your head that you're at the end of your life, you're just decrepit old man, wish fulfillment, you will begin to feel that way. And I do think that's one of the things that this book is absolutely exploring with this concept of old age. That is, and it's in your mind. You can, I mean, obviously age is age, you're going to get old, but like the way you act, the way you behave, the way you live your life is dictated by your mindset more than it is dictated by the number that is next to your birthday.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's in the book actually.
So. Yeah, totally. I think it would be really interesting to just ask a 74-year-old Stephen King, what do you think about Ralph Roberts now? I think he would have a lot of really interesting things to say about that, actually.
Yeah. Well, let's put that on our list of things to ask him when we get a chance to at some point in the future. Okay.
So we got a bunch of other questions, and they didn't necessarily fall into like any easily dividable subsections. So this is just kind of the random questions that I think will lead to interesting conversations part of the show.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
All right. So first we have Baby Can You Dig Your Sam, who says, I read this book back in 1994, and it's always been just okay. After the events of 9/11, I remember talking to my husband a lot about this book. I was aware of kamikaze pilots, but Insomnia was my first intro to the idea of someone crashing a plane into a building and killing thousands of civilians in America. In late September of 2001, this book felt almost prescient. In rereading it and giving the random purpose theme it's made me consider whether the acts on the day were of the random or of the purpose. No Patrick Danville in the World Trade Center, just Black 13 to destroy. What do you think King is saying about Jake and Para Callahan leaving Black 13 there after reading Insomnia? Ooh, good question, Matt. What do you think?
Well, wow, that's a tough one.
Yeah, 9/11 purpose or random, you know? Like, I mean, you could argue it's part of the purpose that, like, there's this terrible thing under there and we need to make sure no one can get to it. So the way the purpose operates in that regard would be, oh, here we go. Let's crash thing. It's knock down a building, so it's never accessible.
Yeah. Do something sort of unthinkably horrible, but it's necessary for the purpose. And that's maybe, I mean, I could go that way and say that that's a statement by King about how horribly evil the purpose can be in its thinking, you know, in the way it operates. Because like we said, the purpose in this book doesn't care about the people in the convention center except for Patrick Danville.
Yeah.
If they had found some other way of saving him, then they wouldn't have cared about the plane crashing into the building. So I think that's kind of a literal connection there is maybe King is saying, like, you know, and this time there was nobody to save the plane from crashing into the building because the purpose didn't require it. So
yeah, because the fate of the universe doesn't rest on that being stopped. It actually might hinge on it being stopped, or hinge on it going forward.
Yeah.
Rather.
Yeah. Well, that's an uncomfortable thing to think about, but
yeah, I mean, I still like we talked about this when we read it in the Dark Tower series of his decision to gesture towards 9/11 so directly with the Black 13 and our kind of general level of discomfort with it. I think it's just one of those things where he was writing this story in 2003, and I mean, September 11th was on everyone's mind for years after that, and still is for a lot of people. And you kind of desire to work that event into your story in different ways. I mean, it's fun, I guess, because you can either say the tower was taken down to bury Black 13, or it happened because Black 13 summoned evil towards it, right? Like there's two different disparate reads of that event, and I'm not quite confident which is the accurate one.
Yeah, I'm not either. I'm not sure what he was intending with that choice exactly. I mean,
I think he was just literally just intending for people to go, Jesus.
So you went there, huh? This soon after? Too soon, Stephen.
Yeah. Baby Can You Do Your Sam asks a second question. They say, in Insomnia, there was an ultimate big baddie with supernatural powers that needed to be defeated. But Insomnia, like other King stories, also included a little baddie, humans under the influence of the big baddie that the protagonist also has to deal with. Think Henry Bowers in It, Harold Lauder in The Stand, and even Jack Torrance in The Shining. What do you see as the similarities and differences in how King portrays these humans who become puppets to greater forces and are major pains in the asses to the main protagonists?
I think that's what King is most interested in talking about is these petty evil humans and the ways in which, you know, we're all kind of like them and have that streak within us, and then uses the supernatural element to make it more fun and exciting, because otherwise it would just be depressing. Yeah,
I think one big complaint I would have about Insomnia is I wish we had a little bit more Ed Deep now and a little bit less Crimson King. Because I think Ed is inherently so much more fascinating than a Crimson King could ever possibly be. And I kind of, this is why I have just never had a problem with King's portrayal of any of these big bads in these stories, because they're almost always like disappointing and more minor than the story would lead you to believe they were going to be. But I like that because, Ed Deep now is just a way more interesting of a character. And I think we talked about this during the course of the Dark Tower, this idea of King's concept of what evil is. And I think he views these people that allow this evil into their heart and to their mind as worse than the great unknowable evil that exists. Like I think to Stephen King, there is in this world this great evil that just exists and is everywhere and is just omnipresent, but the way that evil ultimately harms us and destroys us is when we allow it to be channeled through individual people, the little baddies, as Baby Kenny Digger Sam put it.
Yeah, because, you know, if the big baddies could just do what they wanted to do without relying on humans, then they would. Mm-hmm. So usually they're limited in some way, which is which implies that they are kind of weak, and thus, you know, it's the humans' willingness to go along with it that actually enables it. And in that sense, it does mean they're worse.
Yeah, and I always love how King never takes the culpability away from them. Like, yes, the Crimson King corrupted Ed Deep now, but he never gives Ed an out. Even in the moments where in his final moments where he's frantically trying to channel, you know, old Ed Deep now, like this love he had for his kid and his wife. It's like, yeah, well, you did this, buddy. It's still your fault.
Right. You had a chance. He's very clear to say, like, you had a chance to turn this around, and instead you just wore it like a shroud.
Yep. Everybody gets a choice, and you made your choice. Yep. And of course, these other names that that Sam referenced here are names that mean nothing to you now, but they absolutely will. Okay. I mean, I guess Jack Torrance is a name that means something to you.
Yeah, I've heard the name.
You've heard of that guy. Yeah.
I've heard of that guy.
All right.
Next questions from King Moko. They say, now that I've finally caught up with you guys again, I have a couple of questions. Having read so many books and short stories and stories within those books in these 2 seasons so far, what story is your favorite? Is it a book, a short story, or what? That's question one. I hadn't thought about this at all, and I actually don't think that I could even remember all of the stories that we have read off the top of my head.
You can't remember the Dark Tower novels?
Can't remember. Well, also, okay, Salem's Lot, Insomnia, and then the short stories that we read, and then all the Dark Tower novels. Mm-hmm. I don't know, man. I guess I still go back to various parts of the Dark Tower if we're thinking about favorite and just like what I think back on more frequently. Probably still either the Blaine stuff or the you know, parts of the drawing of the three just for sheer fun value.
Sure.
But I've definitely found like other kinds of value than just pure fun value in the other stories, you know. Like Insomnia is not nearly as fun as those books, but in some ways I think it might stick with me longer than anything in the Dark Tower. You know, time will tell on that one because I did just finish it. That's how I feel right now anyway. Do you have a clear favorite?
I mean, yes. I still think Wizard and Glass is one of my favorite novels ever, period. So it's one of my favorite of these. I think the answer I'm going to give here is the answer I gave for a similar question back in the Dark Tower times, which is Song of Susanna was the biggest surprise to me throughout this entire project so far, how much I deeply loved that book. So I'll pick that as my quote unquote favorite, even though it's not. I will say I'm listening to Wizard and Glass right now, the audiobook, because I was kind of in my copious amounts of spare reading time. I'm listening to the Dark Tower again on audiobook because I never stop. And I just got to Wizard and Glass, and I just got to the opening chapters of Wizard and Glass, which are the riddling fight with Blaine the Mono. And, you know, the moments of Eddie's stepping up and Dead Baby Joke defeating Blaine is one of the greatest moments in storytelling. Like it's just so fun how King like effortlessly like leads us to it, like this all hope is lost moment, and then Eddie Dean's like standing up and smiling because he's finally gotten it, and he knows, and it's just so fun. It's just so fun because it's like, you know, you're kind of waiting for Eddie to get his moment over the past 3 books. You know, you're just waiting. You're waiting. Like the weird thing about the Wastelands when you go back and read it is how incredibly cruel Roland is to Eddie Dean throughout that entire book. And like, even as he's having these moments of he's the one that makes the key that gets Jake in, but like his essential Eddie-ness is kind of being pushed out of him because Roland is trying to mold these gunslingers in his own image because it's the only thing he knows. And Eddie is not him at all, and he cannot ever become him, and Roland needs to realize that. And so it's this culmination of this 3-book long arc, and it's just so fucking wonderful. So Wizard and Glass, man, it's such a good book. Like you even forget that that's part of Wizard and Glass because you just lump the Blaine stuff in with Wastelands, and Wizard and Glass is just the Hambry stuff, but no, that's in there too, and it's so good.
Yeah, I do always forget that does not. I forget where it falls. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The second half of King Moko's question was the death bugs Ralph and Lois kept seeing. Could they have something to do with the doctor bugs in Little Sisters of Illyria? What do you think? Or did we discuss this possibility already? I mean, that was honestly what I thought about, but then there was no further thing that made the connection obvious. So
yeah, I mean, it's weird because like in a lot of ways, I think when King wants to draw those lines between stuff, he makes it super obvious. Like that's we had, even after our Green Man question, we had some people saying that they were absolutely convinced the Green Man was just Matron, the Turtle Guardian, because of connections to Derry, that we'll talk about when we talk about it one day, because of it just made a lot of sense. And while I totally buy into that, I just feel like Stephen King's the type of person where he would let you know it's a turtle. Like if the Green Man is supposed to be Matron, like he would just tell you that. Like in some, it wouldn't come right and say, "Oh, it's the gray turtle," but like it's like, "Huh,
yeah,
is that a shell?" Like
right.
He would just like do it in some way. So the weird thing with this is that the Little Sisters of Illyria was written. When was that written? After Insomnia, I'm pretty sure.
So, I mean, I think certain things have actually crystallized in this conversation, which is that King saw this book as a plotty book. He was consciously saw it as plot. This is a book that I'm plotting. This is a plot-heavy book. And King is a very meta writer. He thinks about stories, and he weaves the way that he thinks about stories into his stories. And so he ends up with a story where he has the purpose versus the random. And in a storytelling sense, this is plot versus character-driven story, you could say. Okay, it's maybe slightly rough fit, but you could say these are the two ways that King thinks about storytelling. He thinks about structuring things and doing it intentionally versus letting the exigency of the moment propel you. And then he ends up with a scene where he needs a Deus Ex Machina to make things work. And so how does he handle that? Well, he has a weird green guy that he never plans to explain, because that's it within the meta framework of like, you've got the purpose and you've got the random. Well, what is a Deus Ex Machina? Is that the purpose? Is that the random? Is that some other thing that has to just come in unexplained and just hand somebody some earrings? I'm just gonna, that's the way I see it now. Like I literally just see it as like him being cute about his way of thinking about storytelling.
Sure. No, I like that a lot. I like it. As far as are the bugs that Ralph and Lois see the same thing as the doctor bugs, I don't think so. I think they're described a little differently. I think the Little Sisters of Illyria bugs are so distinct in their bell tone ness that I don't think so.
No, and those are physical, actual bugs, whereas these are just kind of dream bugs that symbolize death. King Moko then goes on to say, anyone ever notice that King uses waxing and waning a lot? They say, I only paid attention to it because I remembered the phrase from Wizard and Glass and then kept hearing it used over and over again in Salem's Lot. I even asked some friends, being non-native myself, about this because I felt like it was being overused. I must have heard the phrase at least 10 times in Salem's Lot. It's funny, I never noticed that, but thanks for pointing it out. So now I'll notice it every single time. Appreciate
I think every author has like phrases and sayings that they like to use over and over again. I think Salem's Lot is a perfect story to use waxing and waning a lot, because that's dealing with moons and sunrises, and it's just perfect for a story about night and day and vampires.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, like, you'll see more and more. You'll see more phrases that I'm not going to. I'm thinking of some right now, but I don't want to break Stephen King for everyone, because like the more you shine light on this stuff, the more you kind of roll your eyes at when you see it. But yeah, he definitely has some repeat phrases that he likes to use a lot.
I'm trying to remember what author it was who used susurrus like 3 times in a book, and I was like, okay, please stop. All right, cool.
All right, next up we have Shortstop 88, who asks me, of all the books we still have to read for season 2, which are you most looking forward to discussing with Matt? I mean, it's a cheat to say all of them, so I guess I'll pick one in particular. I mean, of course, I'm really excited about reading The Stand with you, because it's just a masterpiece of a book, and it's going to be so fun to talk about that book with you. But I think like the one that I'm most excited is The Talisman, which is the Peter Straub collaboration book. I think that book's just a lot of fun, and I think you're going to really enjoy it in ways that remind you of reading The Dark Tower. So I'm just really looking forward to that one.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to both of those. So, and
then The Eyes of the Dragon is such a different kind of book that I think it's going to be really fun too, because like Salem's Lot is King trying to do Dracula, The Eyes of the Dragon is Salem's Lot, or is a Stephen King trying to do a very classic type of fantasy novel. And I think it's really fun.
Awesome.
Really fun.
Awesome.
It's got lots of good stuff coming up, man. Lots of good stuff.
Yeah.
They go on to ask a second question. They say, this is for both of us. As we're approaching 100 episodes of this podcast, holy shit, I've begun to hear the death clock of season 2 of Kingslingers. It's a ways off, but it's there. Yeah, it's literally a year off, Shortstop. Like a year. We got a whole year left. Do y'all think that when season 2 is over, you'll switch gears to find something else to do a long series discussion / deep dive into? As much as Matt seems to love each new book of Stephen King, I'm worried he might get burnt out of the third season, appears on the heels of the second. If you don't do another season, what are some other ideas you might do instead? That's a really good question. Obviously, yeah, like I looked at the calendar earlier today because we had to shift everything a week because we missed an episode last week because I was sick. We literally, season 2 is looking to end this time next year. We're going to finish The Stand at the end of October, and then we've got like a season wrap-up episode. So that doesn't even count any of the Stand adaptations we might take a look at. So it's going to be about November of next year before we're wrapping up season 2. But like with season 1, I think we're being very loose and non-committal. I think our thing has always been, if we're still having fun, we're going to still do some stuff. But we also like trying new things and experimenting with different kinds of formats and different authors and different stories. So I'm not going to say 100% that there's definitely going to be a season 3, but I'm not going to say that there's not. I definitely have some books, Matt, on my Stephen King list that don't necessarily fall into a neat, like, this is a Dark Tower novel that I really want to talk about with you. I mean, it is my favorite Stephen King novel, and we're not talking about that this year. So I don't know, like, I don't know if there would be a season 3 or there would be, hey, let's just do a couple one-offs.
Yeah.
Not necessarily directly following, but
yeah. It's sort of like best, like your favorite King novels that you think I would like, and then we can just do those. I mean, I'm currently really enjoying Stephen King, and I can see that as being a thing that we could do. But we did literally years of the Parahumans podcast before this, and then we totally switched from Wildbow over to King, and it's totally conceivable that we could switch yet again to some other thing and focus our attention on that, because one of the things it's important to me to always feel like I'm learning.
Yeah.
And after a certain number of years of studying one author, I think, number one, I don't feel like I'm learning anymore. And number two, I start to sound repetitive.
Sure.
And I don't want that to happen. And I don't think any of you folks want that to happen either. So I would rather stop before the point when you decide that I have become repetitive. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I've always kind of wanted to take this general format and try it in different mediums. Like I really want to take the one person new, one person expert thing and do a TV show on it. It doesn't have to be Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but that would be a really good one. I've always wanted to try that. Like I think we are both people that like trying new things and like experimenting with new formats and stuff, but also understand that part of the reason we love doing this is because we love this format we kind of stumbled into. So yeah, I mean, it's up in the air right now. We've got a while to think about it, but it is something that we're going to be thinking about and reassessing and pondering as we go through the next 12 months and the next 5 or 6 books that we're going to be talking about. So we'll see. That death clock is very quiet right now. Shortstop.
It's a very quiet and distant death clock.
Yes.
And I'd say the odds that we're going to do something after season 2 are as close to 100% as I care to.
Oh yeah.
To bet.
We're gonna make something, whether it's Kingslinger season 3, whether it's anything to do with Stephen King at all. I just don't know.
Yeah.
I just don't know.
Right. Yep. Cool. All right. Next question was from Domnambulist. Matt, what do you think of the idea that the Green Man is King's tribute to the Green Army in The Lord of the Rings, and at the same time, he is making fun of it, something green that just pops up out of nowhere to save the story? Totally. That's one of the best explanations I've heard, actually. A good Lord of the Rings connection. It's Treebeard. The Green Man is Treebeard.
It is. It's just Treebeard. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great. Perfect.
There we go. Thanks, Tom Nambulis. You did it.
You did it.
Appealed to Matt where he lives.
Yeah.
And won the Green Man conversation.
Yeah. Y'all really, you found the hack to this podcast, actually. And then they also asked, Scott and Matt, this is a great point to thank you for your delightful podcast. I've never read as much as I do now. This is how books should have been treated in school. Thank you. That wasn't actually a question.
It was not, but it was very nice.
Yes.
I will say, I think it's very difficult to actually do a book like this in school. Like there's hundreds of hours we do, and you don't have that kind of time in school. But I agree. Like, I think, I don't know. I'm not a teacher. So I'm not going to lecture English teachers. I don't know what's going on, but I do think this is a very fun, engaging format that I do think gets people to engage with stories in a way that they might not have otherwise.
I mean, I think one thing about it is just like it's being forced to actually think these things through and talk about them helps you learn and break things down much more than just passively listening to somebody else talk. But the way that school is structured, it almost has to be listening to someone else talk, or at best, the teacher can sometimes try to lead a discussion. And what that almost always ends up looking like is like a lot of awkward waiting for the students to say something. And none of them want to say something because they don't want to embarrass themselves because they're teenagers or whatever. And I just wish there was a way of getting them to actually genuinely have discussions. Like maybe the answer is break them up into discussion groups. But even then, I don't know how you foster the passion to actually like push through and have that conversation.
Just divide everyone up into teams of 3 and everyone makes a podcast.
I mean, but yes, that's a very good suggestion, actually. Just do that.
That actually is a fun idea. I don't think you could you wouldn't have the equipment like to do it well, but that almost doesn't matter. It's just a technique. Like the audio quality doesn't matter. It's just like just by giving people the exercise, pretend like you have to do a podcast episode on Macbeth. What would you talk about? Yeah. How would you structure it? How would you there's 3 of you. You need to make sure all 3 of you talk and interact and have ideas. Mm-hmm. How would you do that? That's a good idea, actually.
As long as we're taking this idea semi-seriously, one problem is just that when I was a teenager, I definitely didn't have the skill of being able to open my mouth and have sensible things come out.
Sure.
That was something that I developed over subsequent decades of practice and just general maturation. But there's something to be said for just forcing them to do it anyway. And if they do a bad job, that's okay because they're teenagers.
Yeah, if they do a bad job, you just fail them.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
failures.
Yeah, you shouldn't talk about books. Actually, you did a bad job.
Yeah, maybe we don't read.
Yeah,
maybe you just watch.
Yeah,
reality television.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. Is this next one yours or is it mine?
I think it's yours.
Daniel D says, I was curious if you might ever do a Kingslingers version of your book club. Figured King has so many dang books, it would be a good chance to cover a book you don't want to spend weeks or months about. The smaller books like The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon are books that may be lower on Scott's list, like Dreamcatcher. And just for the record, that book gets a bit of a bad rap. It definitely isn't anywhere near the top, but parts where everything is clicking are real good. Just thought it might be a cool way to cover some shorts, novellas, lower ranked works, and have communal palaver with some kindred spirits. Yeah, I think that's a good idea and something we might want to look at. I mean, we definitely have done that with Carrie. It was like one of our very first book clubs we did before Kingslingers even existed, where we talked about Carrie for a couple of hours. So we've done it in the past. It might be a good way to talk about. I mean, there's things like It and The Shining. I definitely wouldn't want to do that way because I want to spend some time on those with you. But yeah, I mean, I do want to have conversations with you about Stephen King short stories, because I think some of his best writing is in his short stories, and that might be a way to do it in a fun, different kind of way.
Yeah, I agree. That's a fun idea. There's got to be some books in there where maybe you don't want or don't think that we should give them like a 4-month-long treatment, but they would fit in a book club very well. So, and I really enjoy the book club format too. So
yeah, especially, I mean, like, I love, like, I can't tell you how many times I've come to book club being like, I did not like this book. I do not have anything nice to say about it. I don't know how the hell I'm going to talk about it for 2 hours. And then we have like 20 people in there that loved the book and have all these really interesting things to say about it. And they managed to influence my opinion on it in really fun ways. I think that's great. And that's why we do those live. That's why we do those in an interactive kind of way.
Yeah. And I mean, just continuing to riff on our half joking suggestion that everyone should do podcasts about books. Like when you're forced to open your mouth and say things about the book that you just read, you will find something to say, even if you didn't think you had anything to say. And then afterward, you'll be like, I guess there was more to that than I necessarily realized.
And there's this really frustrating thing about book clubs in that there's a lot of stigma against them in our society, that like they're either for women only or for old people only. And it makes it so it's really difficult to actually like find a book club. Like the reason you and I started the book club is because I wanted to join a book club, and the only ones I could find in my area that like actually met were women only, or a bunch of 60 and 70-year-old people that I just had nothing in common with. It felt kind of weird. Like I went to one and it just I felt awkward because I was the youngest person by like 50 years. And I think it's ridiculous. And I think there's a lot of people out there that would love to talk about books, but for whatever reason, just the concept of a book club is just not popular amongst a wide variety of people. So we said, let's start one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, what am I trying to say here? It's important to have the right mindset too, because I think you can find yourself in a book club that is not the kind of discussions that you were interested in having.
Yeah. I mean, I have friends that are women that are in book clubs, but it's just, they just want to get together and drink wine. They don't actually ever like, I feel like I would go to that book club if they ever invited me, and I would be like ready to talk about the book for 45 minutes. And they would be like, yeah.
I have a story that I'm still mad about, which is that when I was much, much younger, probably like literally an undergraduate, my group of friends, one of my groups of friends said, "Oh, we're going to do a book club. Let's all buy Catch-22 and read Catch-22, which is like a literary, classic or whatever."
Such a good book.
And like a week after that, one of the people in the book club sent out an email to everyone else and said, "Oh, this book is just awful. No one read it." And then no one did. And then the book club stopped immediately. There was no book club. They just successfully killed the book club.
It's a really good book.
And I've still never read Catch-22.
It's a really good book, Matt. Read Catch-22.
I know. Like, I mean, I was mad because it was like, oh, so you just decided it was bad, and then you killed any possibility of anyone else reading it and having a different reaction and having a discussion, like what you would imagine a book club would be for.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah. Anyway, next question is this one from Steve L. Are you going to do another Do the King thing writing contest? If so, I think the theme should be write whatever you want, but put Matt and Scott as characters in the stories.
Oh my God.
Oh, that sounds really uncomfortable.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, I don't know, man.
I mean, we're definitely going to do another one.
Yeah.
I don't know about your prompt. That feels a little too, I don't know. For us to say that, like to declare it officially the rules, that sounds
a little self-indulgent for us.
But
if you want to do that, that would, I'm sure, be funny and also awkward for me.
Yes.
So, which is more funny for you. So, They also ask, has insomnia affected you while reading this? Yes.
Yeah, I think you talked about that already. How much it affected?
Yeah, it affected me a lot, and there's a lot of personal stuff which maybe I didn't talk about very much on the podcast because it's personal. And sometimes I talk about personal stuff. Sometimes it's a little bit too raw, and I don't necessarily want to make a spectacle of it as I am experiencing it. But yes, it definitely it felt it hit me pretty hard at a lot of points for sure.
Yeah, me too. I think I've been fortunate enough to where I haven't really dealt with a death in my family for a while now. I think my grandmother passed away. Gosh. 7 years ago now, which isn't that long in the scheme of things, but so it's been a while since I've really dealt with death directly in my family. So the effects that I had were not as quite like real and present as perhaps yours were, but stories about death always affect me in this very, very incredibly personal way, just because like I think I've been very upfront throughout this whole thing that like death is it's not the type of thing that terrifies me to the point I'm thinking about it constantly, but like anytime I do think about it, it terrifies me. Because I really like being alive. It's really neat.
Right.
It's really fun. And I am terrified of dying and there being nothing. And that's just the concept of nothingness. And then of course, whenever I have this conversation with my dad, he's like, well, but if there was nothing, you wouldn't know. And I'm like, yeah, but don't you understand how that's scary?
Right. That I find that to be completely not comforting at all. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The idea that it's like, well, do you remember before you were born? No, there's just nothing.
Yeah.
How is
but
that supposed to?
But I remember right now, and right now I'm terrified of the concept of there being nothing.
Yeah. Just nothing ever again and no perception of it. Cool. That sounds great. No,
I'm really comforted now.
Yeah. They asked what is our favorite memory of the podcast. That's a really hard one.
I have a lot, but I think one of the coolest things for me that I'm so happy worked out the way it did was our final episode of season 1, where we just got to play all of y'all's voicemails back to back to back. That was so cool. It's like, I think we talked about it at the time, but it's one of those things that like you have the idea in your head and like, this could be really cool or it could not work at all. And I think it ended up working really well. And I thought that was so cool. Like as I was putting it together and editing it together and listening to it, I was like, oh my God, this is really, really cool. Just a collage of people explaining why the Dark Tower is so important to them was awesome. So that was a great moment that I loved.
Whenever you open things up to kind of unfiltered audience participation, there's risks. But y'all,
no one's gonna send any in.
Yeah,
they're gonna be like completely unintelligible. There's so many risks.
Yeah, but y'all always do great. Every time we ask anything of you, you do great. So we really appreciate y'all. You're a big part of this, as you know, because we are reading the mailbag questions right now, obviously.
Besides that, and I'm just buying time to give you time to come up with your own answer. But besides that, I mean, it's just like I love this story so much, and these stories are so important to me. And seeing it through your eyes has just been an absolute joy. Like getting to the end of the Dark Tower and getting to talk about the ending with you is definitely one of the highlights for me, just because it's so crazy and powerful, and I've never really been able to have a conversation about it that I was really happy about. And I got to with you. So that was really cool for me.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. I think that helps me cement what I was going to say is my favorite. I think it's just my favorite sort of thing we've done, which is silly, but it was what we did, where we pretended that the podcast was over and we weren't going to read the coda, and then we just did the theme song, and then we came back and did it for real. But like, I don't know, that felt fun, and then of course I think it was a really good conversation, and it was fun to sort of have those two separate conversations that way too. So.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Then finally, Steve L asks, if Stephen King came on as a guest to your podcast, what would you ask/say to him? Wow, Steve L, you've just given us just a bunch of softball questions today. Appreciate it. Well, I mean, I like the idea of asking about like how he feels about Ralph Roberts now that he's super elderly. And I would definitely phrase it that way. I'd be like, now that you're super, super old.
Hey, Steve, now that you're old as fuck.
Yeah.
How do you feel about old people? Yeah. I'm sure he'd love that.
I would also want to ask him about Ka, but in a way that was designed to get him more talking than just validating my theory. Yeah.
I think the biggest concern and fear I have with an opportunity that is absolutely never going to present itself to us, so there's no reason for concern at all, is I don't want to, like, you don't want to ask the questions he's been asked 1,000 times before, but you want to ask a question that gets him talking about stuff like his process and what the story means to him. Like, I don't like any interaction I have with Stephen King, I want to be more him talking than it is me asking questions. So like in a perfect world, I ask one question that gets him talking about stuff for an hour, and then I can just sit back and listen to him talk about it,
Yeah. That would be the ideal. I agree. Because it means you ask just the right question.
Yeah. And I mean, for everyone that has met him has said about him is like, he's actually very, very easy to talk to. He's just very, very laid back type of personality, and is just so ready to talk about anything and everything. I mean, I think the trick is actually to not ask him about his work. It's to ask him about other people's work. I think that is what would get him off, because like a person who loves storytelling as much as he does, like, doesn't necessarily want to talk about his books all the time. He wants to talk about other books that he's been reading and fun stuff like that. So I think the way to kind of gear that conversation around Dark Tower would be talk about like exactly when in the process of creating the story did he realize that he wanted to kind of structure Dark Tower around not just the Robert Browning poem, but like hundreds of different stories about all different things, and make it the center of not just the Stephen King universe, but of all storytelling universes, and what other stories he would include in the Dark Tower if he ever wrote more about it, and all these other cool things.
Yeah. And I'd ask him why he's so unfair to the Wheel of Time also.
Because it's bad.
Well, that's your opinion, Scott.
Next up, we have Sigma, who says, what is your favorite piece of media about death? Wow. That's a big question. I don't know. What is your favorite piece of media about death? I mean, the thing is, we just talked about Dr. Sleep, so it's on my mind, and Dr. Sleep deals with death very directly in a lot of ways that I just adore. So I feel like it's a cheat to give that answer, because like the only reason I'm thinking of it is because we just talked about it. But yeah, Dr. Sleep.
Yeah, I don't have a really good answer. I think that I don't usually enjoy stories about this topic because it's sad. I mean, I can think of a lot of stories where death is a major element of the story, but I can't think of a lot where I would say they're about death, I mean, unless you want to be very literal and say like Meet Joe Black or something, which I would not put on my list of favorite stories about death. So I don't really know if I have a whole lot of movies even on my mind that I could say are about death, or books for that matter. I mean, to be even more literal, we read Reaper Man by Terry Pratchett, and that was actually a pretty good, much like Insomnia, it's a story that makes you think about death because the main character is death, and makes you think about all of the functions that death serves in our world that maybe we don't appreciate, you could say. So I don't know. I'll throw that out there as a possibility. I don't know if I have a solid answer.
Yeah, I like that. I will also mention The Good Place, one of my favorite shows of the last few years that dealt with a lot of different aspects of death and life and what it all means. And I'm a big fan of that show. Big fan of that show.
Yeah, it also reminds me of like Dead Like Me, which I think that show ended prematurely, and thus you never really understood what they were like, where they were going with the themes. But I enjoyed it when it was on. So.
Really good show. Like that show a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sigma also asks, have you guys noticed that cars are kind of an evil presence in King's works? I listened to King's Drawing of the 3 episode with Matt Fraction, and Mr. Fraction pointed that out. First, there was Jake's death, the death of Eddie and Henry's younger sister, Christine. And then this. I'm sure there's more King works. I keep thinking about what Mr. Fraction said. Yeah. Cars kill a lot of people in story. There's other King stories that I don't want to spoil for Matt that have deaths
I know Pet Cemetery has a.
See, that was the one I was thinking.
Yeah,
of. Technically not. That's not a car though.
I just know everything.
I don't know. I think so. To get a little armchair psychology here, I think it's King has said that he witnessed a friend be hit by a train when he was younger, and he's kind of completely blocked that memory out of his head somehow. That's like the trauma just kind of forced the memory out of his head, and that's kind of the that's where the body comes from, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the body, the short story. And so I think perhaps he just has a general fear of people being struck by fast moving machinery. But I just think like in a world of like cars are kind of scary because they're this like really heavy piece of metal that for some crazy reason society allows us to drive really, really fast. Like it's kind of crazy when you just think about it abstractly, right?
Yeah.
Like 70 miles an hour, which is what I can go on the highways in Texas. 75 actually in some places. It's like that's so fucking fast.
It is funny how I went from like you're first learning to drive and it's kind of terrifying. And then you really get used to it really quickly. Like then it's just fine. And then for years and years I was totally comfortable with driving. And then I had kids and then I was like, oh my God, we're going so fast. Mm-hmm. This is so dangerous. If I make the slightest mistake, or if anyone else on the road makes the slightest mistake, then this is going to be horrible. And it like made me self-conscious about driving again. But yeah, like definitely it's just objectively insane that we do this thing that we do where we drive places on freeways.
I think a lot of this is King channeling that insanity and like, look how it's also just like, it's a very relatable kind of way to kill off a character too, because like everyone drives a car. So everyone at some point has thought of, and probably most people have been in car accidents, hopefully not serious ones, but I think everyone's been in at least like a fender bender. And so you can kind of see just how often we're riding the line between safety and death and destruction and horror.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even a minor fender bender is like it shakes you up, and it's probably the most traumatic thing that happens to the average person in the average month. So,
yeah, definitely. Yeah. I had a tire of mine blow on a toll road with not a very big shoulder, and that was really scary because it's like, okay, I guess I'll go outside and change my tire when cars are blowing by at 75, 80 miles an hour. And even if like they're not directly in front of you, just like the air that a car pushes when it's going that fast as it goes by you.
Yeah.
It's just insane.
Yeah.
I'm just like out here with my little tiny jack, like trying to jack up my tire to get my spare on. And thank God eventually like the toll, like, cause it was a toll road. So they had their own like maintenance people and they like saw me and came up and shut down the lane next to me. So it was less scary. But before that, it was like 10 minutes of me jacking up my car and like having to pause every 30 seconds because I saw a car coming. I was like, I'm getting the fuck away from this. It's just fucking scary, man. Cars are scary.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, it's not even that uncommon that you'll be driving and then something like ridiculously cinematic will happen. Like a full, like at some point, like a full size ladder fell off of a truck not too far ahead of me and I managed to avoid it. But then like other cars just like pulverized it, and then you've got like ladder shrapnel all over the freeway and flying up into the air and hitting people's windshields, and it's just like this kind of thing happens all the time.
Especially when so many people are on their fucking phone these days, which like 9 times out of 10 is going to be fine because you're just going in a straight line. But yeah, the second some event happens on the road that requires you to react quickly, you're just boned.
Yep.
And it's ugh.
Yep.
Driving. I don't like. I don't. It's funny. I don't actually do much of it anymore because I'm working from home. So literally, my only driving now is I drive to the daycare to drop my son off, and then I go pick him up.
Yeah.
And then go to the grocery store, and then occasionally on the weekends I'll get on the highways and drive different places. But I'm driving so much less than I did when I was having to go into the office.
Yeah, I go in the office a couple times a week, and still sucks.
I never want to go back to an office ever again. One of my clients asked if we could have a meeting, to a face-to-face meeting on their site, and I was just like, why? Dude, are you sure? Are you sure about that?
Yeah, I get it. We got Zoom, we got Teams. What do you want to meet?
Yeah. All right.
Oh, there's more to this question.
No,
okay. All 84001 says, coffee talk. I'm a little verklempt. Talk amongst yourselves. I'll give you a topic. Stephen King's greatest blunder: losing the original outline to the Dark Tower, or never once saving the quartet by whisking them out of harm's way on the backs of a bunch of great eagles. What is a group of eagles sometimes called? A tower. Discuss.
Is that true?
I don't know.
Is a group of eagles called a tower?
Let's see.
That's wild. I'm looking it up.
It's a tower. It's real.
Wow.
It's one of the several words you can use for a bunch of eagles.
I like Jubilee of Eagles better, to be honest with you. Yeah. But
I like a soar of eagles. I don't know. I don't like. I mean, it's a fun question, but I also don't like to think about things in terms of being flaws or mistakes, because I think it encourages a way of look. I like to complain and criticize so much that if I let myself do it, then I just go full bore in that direction. And so I've learned that the best way to keep like positive and constructive and analytical is to just not think of things as mistakes, but think of things as choices with consequences that maybe I don't like.
Sure. I mean, yeah, like, yes, is it a tragedy that King lost the original outline to the Dark Tower? Like, imagine what we could have had. Yes, but the version of the story we got is awesome. So who cares about what the original would be like? This version's fucking great.
And I'm inclined to say that if the details didn't stick in his head, then they can't have been that important.
Yeah, it's Ka, baby. You lost that outline for a reason, Stephen.
There definitely should have been eagles, though.
There definitely should have been eagles. I mean, that's a tower of eagle is a real missed opportunity, Stephen.
Yep.
This is why you got to return to the world. Just have a tower of eagle show up.
Yeah, that'll be the one thing, the one thing that he does to add to the Dark Tower.
Great question, though.
Yeah.
Gerardo says, which Stephen King story or stories are each of you looking forward to reading the most, whether they're Dark Tower related or not? I'm personally looking forward to rereading It and Desperation, since it's been 20 years since I've read them. Matt, which story are you looking forward to the most? It doesn't have to be a season 2 story.
Well, everybody says The Stand is so great, and so that makes me really want to read The Stand. I think that's the number one. Just like it seems like one of those things where I can almost predict with confidence in advance that I'm going to love it.
Sure. So. Yeah. I mean, my favorite King book to reread is my favorite King book, which is It. I read that book like every 5 years or so, and love it even more each time. So just that's whenever I'm like feeling feeling, jonesing for another It. Is a really exciting time. I'm about to start rereading 11/22/63, which is one of King's best books and one of his most recent ones, and I'm really excited about that reread as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I keep hearing good things about that too.
Yeah,
but that'll be somewhere on the list. And then the final questioner is Walking Dude 22. Who says several questions. How does the fact that this story was the introduction of the Crimson King as a character affect your interpretation of his overall role in the Dark Tower universe? I think we talked a bit about the idea that King obviously either changed his mind about who the Crimson King is, or else the Crimson King is more of an abstract force than you would conclude just by seeing the version of him that is at the end of the Dark Tower. That'd be my interpretation.
Yeah, I mean the version of the Crimson King we see at the very end of the story is a beaten, driven back shell of the person he was formerly, by design, and so he's going to be different. I totally understand. We talked about this when we got to the Santa Claus Crimson King in that book. Like, I totally understand why people especially see this version of the character. The Crimson King is this incredibly powerful guy who like turns into a spooky catfish just to freak out Ralph. And I totally get this feeling of disappointment and letdown at the final confrontation with him being, he's just some unhinged Santa Claus. I totally get it, but I just don't care. Like, I've never cared about the Crimson King as a character. I just don't care about him. He's like if you just subbed out the word evil for Crimson King, I would be fine with it. So his role in the Dark Tower universe is to be the stand-in for evil, and that's it. And I'm fine with that.
Right. That's the best thing about Sauron, is that we don't ever really know what Sauron is up to. And King understands that. And that's why the Crimson King is the way he is.
Yep. Agree.
Yeah. Next question. Might the gray men have meant two people when they said Patrick would save two men? They are somewhat... Sorry, let me read that again. Might the gray men have meant two people when they said Patrick would save two men? They are somewhat oblivious to short-time concerns like gender. I mean,
they're saying that like Susanna would have counted as one of the two people.
But see, here's the thing. Did he really save Susanna? You could only argue that the only way in which he saved Susanna is like maybe he made a little bit of noise when they were in the house and that clued her in that something was up. But by the time he actually does anything meaningful, Susanna's already gone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I really do think he just changed his mind. But
I do too. I mean, I think that's a fair read. I do think I don't think we ever see the little bald men have any confusion on gender in the story itself. So maybe if that was set up a little bit more, I could see that argument. But it's like they seem not to be like there's no confusion of like that Lois is a woman and Ralph is a man. I mean, in their minds.
I always think it's funny how the first thing he says to Ralph is "Hello, man." Such a cute greeting.
You're right. Like it's specifically gendered because they probably actually are more interested in gender than we are because they don't seem to have any. And so like it's one of those short time things that they find fascinating and confusing.
Yeah. Good point. Next question. Do we need a bridge novel to show how Patrick came to be enslaved by Dandolo? I wouldn't mind it. It's kind of, I'm fine without it, but I can imagine that there's a story somewhere in there.
Yeah, I mean, how did he get to Midworld in the first place?
Exactly.
We don't know.
And he can't talk, so he doesn't get to tell his story. In fact, that's kind of interesting because the pattern of the Dark Tower in general seems to be a character pops in from some other Stephen King novel, and then they tell their story at great length about how they ended up in Midworld. But Danville doesn't have a tongue, so he can't tell the story. And he's just maybe there is a story out there somewhere.
Yeah, King was getting really close to his drop dead date for delivering the manuscript, and so he just cut out his tongue so he didn't have to do the whole story beat.
Solve that problem. Yeah. Kill your darlings. Cut your darlings' tongues out.
Yeah, I'm not clamoring for it. I think it works as just this kind of nebulous mystery. It actually I don't think would have worked. All joking aside, I don't think it would have worked in the Dark Tower book itself. It just it only would have been interesting for the people that knew Patrick from Insomnia, and for anyone else reading it without that knowledge, it would have just been like, okay, like he already feels really random on his own. Like it's just like this last minute addition that just kind of comes into this story. And a lot of people don't like Patrick Danville's inclusion in the story at all because it just feels so last minute and weird. It feels weird that he's the one at the end there with Roland. But I think that's part of why it's brilliant, because like at the end of Roland's quest, who gets to see him walk into the tower? Just some kid. Yeah. Some guy. Right. Doesn't even really know him.
It didn't go the way he wanted it to, because because it was a bad plan, Roland. It was a bad plan.
Yeah. But right. I mean, it would be a fun story to read. I'm sure there is an interesting story there, but I'm not clamoring for it.
I would suspect, I mean, maybe this is a question you could ask King, like, hey, do you have something in mind? Like, do you know how Patrick Danville got to Midworld, or is that just a gray space on your map?
Mm-hmm.
All right, last question. Seriously, what does Stephen King have against Susan's? Salem's Lot, Susan became a vampire. Dark Tower, Susan got Charyu Tree. Susanna Dean came closest to a happy ending, but OMG, what a terrible journey to get there. Susan Day, decapitated by the random. In my headcanon, all of King's Susans are played by Sean Bean.
Here's what I think happened. When Stephen King was a very young boy, he had a crush on a little girl, little young boy crush on a little girl named Susan, and she rebuffed his little boy crush advances. And he might not even remember this event, but it has formed a innate fascination and also distrust of all Susans. So he works it in because the name Susan has some romantic attachment to his brain, but also he can't help but always not punish her, but strike out against her for the little boy rejection he got.
I think you're right.
This has to be.
That's it. Yeah, that's all it can be.
Because it's interesting. Like, it's not like he hates Susans, right? Like, they're almost always the love interest of the piece, with the exception of Susan Day, but they are always not one to survive the story that they're in. So it's this really complicated mixture of love and anger towards these characters. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, maybe there's I mean, perhaps your theory is right. Perhaps there's some literary Susan that he has in mind as this archetype that I'm just not aware of.
Just really fucking can't stand Susan B. Anthony is what it comes from.
Yeah, that's also entirely plausible, Scott. All right. Thanks for all your questions. That was fun, as always.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you guys so much. And that's going to do it for Insomnia. We're filing it away. And next week, we begin Low Men in Yellow Coats. We'll be reading chapters 1 through 4 of Low Men in Yellow Coats. I don't think they are actually marked as chapters. They're just sections. And each section actually has a very long description to it. I think like that it's just like little mini sentences of summarizing the events that happen in that section, but there are numbered sections. So read sections 1 through 4.
All right. Remember, you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And of course, the subreddit at r/doofmedia is a great place to discuss the podcast and just talk about other Stephen King stuff.
Yes, and you should subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. We're available everywhere, and it'll be there every Thursday morning, except when it's not, when I'm sick. And in that case, there'll be something else there. So just subscribe, and you'll never be disappointed.
That's
theoretically.
Right. Yeah. And if you like any of our shows and you want to support them, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia, and you'll get access to all of the previous episodes of Other Levels of the Tower, where Scott and I talk about adaptations of Stephen King's works. We've done a whole bunch of them at this point.
Over a year's worth, I think.
Yeah. And so there's some really great conversations in there. And the last one we did, as we said earlier, is Dr. Sleep. So go check that out, please.
And if you cannot afford to donate, that is absolutely okay. You can always help us out by sharing this podcast with everyone and anyone. We're about to enter a new book, so that's a great time for new people to jump on board. So share it with them if they really have a hankering for Low Men and Yellow Coats. Maybe your friend just walking around, see a person in a yellow coat and say, "Hey, look at this book. It's about you." They might end up being insulted by that, but the important thing is you shared our podcast. You can also help us out by leaving us a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Frog Kicker, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Kingslingers fled across the desert, and I followed. I found this podcast midway through season 1 and instantly added it to my constant listener repertoire. With one gnarled, grizzled vet and an innocent yet-to-be broken King Newbie, they lead you through the action like your old pal Gasher, while taking stops along the way to reflect on the beauty and mystery that makes up King's multiverse. With Season 2 exploring the other various works of Cy King that are related to the Dark Tower, it will make a junkie out of us all, and we say thank you. Plus bonus points for Matt's acute and highly appropriate Simpsons and Lord of the Rings references. I have found my people.
Thank you. Well, Frog Kicker, you clearly do belong with us. And
yeah, kick some frogs and download some Kingslingers.
That's right. Yeah, thank you so much. That warms my heart. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Frog Kicker, and everyone else who has taken the time to leave those ratings and reviews. Keep them coming. We're actually almost out of reviews. I'm looking at my list right now, and we only have 2 more to go. So that's only 2 more weeks worth of reviews to read, and then we're just going to have to sit here at the end of the show looking like idiots.
Yeah.
So please, if you haven't submitted a review, do so.
There'll just be like 15 seconds of silence, and then we'll just move into the outro. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us this week. Next week, new book time. So exciting. We'll see you to begin Low Men in Yellow Coats. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.